Stitch number 1, the backstitch. What you'll need is a single wax thread. I like to have the knot with a clipped tail so we don't have anything sticking out. The goal is to create a sort of spiral to lock everything into place, and you'll see what I mean as we go. And what we're going to be doing is bringing the needle up a stitch's length ahead. So pull it up through and then go a stitch's length behind and a stitch's length ahead of the previous stitch. Once pulled through, you'll see that you have a stitch's length in thread, and then you can repeat the process to create several stitches in a nice line. The first few stitches are always a little bit wonky as you get used to it. Every stitching line kind of has this going, but if you would like to try and keep your stitches as straight as possible, it's easiest by taking your needle and lining it up with your straight line that you have either already drawn or in stitches to keep things nice and straight. You can see as you get further into the stitching that they will get more uniform and they will get straighter as you get more practice. Stitch number 2, the whip stitch. You'll need a single wax thread that's been knotted at the end. To start whipping back your seam allowances on your side seams of stays, you'll need to anchor your thread behind the pressed back seam allowances. Next, you'll need to take a small stitch out of the lining fabric only, being sure to not catch any of the outer fabric, but to be secure enough to keep the seam allowance taut and in place. You'll move the needle through the seam allowance, pulling the fabric taut as you go. When you get to an area that has a lot of boning, I think it's easiest if you stick the needle horizontally through the fabric, letting your needle glide along the boning and grabbing the seam allowance as you go. You'll need to repeat this until the seam allowance is fully whipped into place. You don't want this to be tight, you don't want it to be gaping, you really just want it to be one with the rest of the piece. And be sure to check every so often that you've not caught any of the outer fabric with these stitches. Stitch number 3, the wrap stitch. We're going to use this for eyelets. You'll start with a single piece of thread. It'll need to be waxed and then doubled on the needle. What I like to do is first wax the entire thread really well, so I know that it's fully coated. After that, I like to thread my needle and double it. wax the thread ends, and then knot the thread as you see fit. I've found that waxing the entire thread really helps the two threads to act as one, and you have less hiccups when it comes to making the wrap stitch possible. You'll need a tapered awl or some sort of tapered implement in order to make the eyelet holes. I have an antique awl that I like to use, but also a chopstick. In order to keep the eyelets a consistent size, I put a small elastic on my tapered implement, and it really helps in making sure that I don't make the eyelets too large or too small and that everything is just right. Typically, I end up piercing through the hole and stretching the fibers about 2 times, once on the right side and once on the back side. I found that this keeps the hole open for longer and I don't have to worry about stray threads getting in my way. Now, before we start, I do want to say that I like to do my eyelets in 2s, and I like to also not clip all my threads. So we'll be anchoring our thread on the inside of the eyelet. You can do this with an extra knot or just backstitching a couple times. From here, I pass the needle up through the eyelet hole and then pierce the needle down through all layers to be able to wrap the raw edge. There are many extant pairs of stays that don't have nearly as many wrap stitches as I have on my eyelets. As few as 3 or 4 are perfectly okay, but I wanted to make sure that these ones are nice and clean. So I ended up doing closer to 15 wrap stitches per eyelet. And now we're going to go in light speed so you don't have to suffer through the whole thing. When you've reached the end of your wrap stitching, then you'll turn your piece around and anchor your thread yet again on the inside of the eyelets, and this is going to be the innermost side of the stays. When you put in the lining, this part will actually be covered up by the lining piece, so that's why they're on the inside rather than the outside. Now you're ready for your second eyelet. Open up the fabric with your tapered implements again. And then, as before, anchor your thread on the innermost side of the eyelet and begin your wrap stitching to complete your second eyelet. Stitch number 4, the butted whip stitch. For this stitch, you'll need either a double or quadruple threaded needle. The butted whip stitch is used to connect the pieces of your stays together, and it'll have the most strain on these spots. For stays made for myself and for others that plan to be pulled in rather tightly, I like to use 4 threads or quadruple my thread. But for the pink stays that I'm working on today, I'm only using 2 because they won't have that much strain on them. First, you'll need to butt together your prepared seam lines for the stays. These are the seams where the seam allowances have been whipped back together. You'll need to anchor the thread where the upper seam lines meet. You can do this by either doing a few back stitches or by knotting your thread. One of my tips for this is to use your fingers, either your thumb or your pointer finger, to keep the thread back and from catching on your seam allowances at the top or the bottom of your stays. You'll pass the needle through all of the layers in a spiral motion in order to complete this stitch. When you've reached the point where you need to knot and finish off your thread, simply knot a couple times and bury your thread underneath the seam allowances of the fabric. Stitch number 5, the upside down herringbone stitch. Now that the side seams have been completed with the butted whip stitch, most extants have a tape or ribbon to cover these seams. To do this, line up your seam tape along the top of the seam line. You want to make sure that the seam tape is overlapping, so later on the binding will cover it up and you won't have any raw edges. Now use a single threaded needle with wax thread that's been knotted at the end, and pass the needle through all layers near the edge of the tape. Anchor the tape down with a few back stitches. I typically do 2 or 3 just to make sure that everything stays in place. You'll need to pass your needle up through all layers near the edge of the seam line. Then you will backstitch along the edge of the seam line and then pass the needle under the tape diagonally to come up again through the other side of the seam. Repeat the backstitch with diagonal pass underneath the seam tape, but coming again on the opposite side of the seam tape edge. This method may seem odd at first, but it really is the easiest method to attach your seam tape to the stays themselves. The reason for this is when you do the back stitch, you ensure that you are catching the fabric underneath and that the seam tape will stay in place. You'll repeat the back stitch with the diagonal pass to the other side, being sure to catch the fabric underneath. Another method for areas without boning is to stab downward through all fabrics and work the thread on the back side of the stays. Work the thread diagonally underneath the stays and stab upward through all layers of fabric, catching the tape at the very edge. You'll again perform the back stitch, stabbing down, and repeat the diagonal pass on the back side of the fabric. This will create a visible zigzag line on the inside of your stays that will later be covered up by your lining.